Action. Okay, I did want to make a mention. Today, if you're in at 8 o'clock, you already heard it, but the sermon's about covetousness and greed. But the thing that's interesting about it is it's the parable of the ruler who stored away his goods in grain, right? The farmer, and
but then you die the next day.
But he died the next day. But you know why? Do you know why? What was the problem?
He said he wasn't going to do anything the rest of his life. He was just going to hang out.
Yeah, but what was the big deal about him doing what he did? There's two things in that I think are really important historically that really didn't get mentioned. Yeah, we hear it all the time, but why was God so unhappy with him? Or Jesus? Same thing. Okay, so what were you supposed to do with your grain? Tithe it, right? So the way it worked was you would not save it up in a silo or keep it in your place, because what that meant was that it wasn't tithed, right? Because it wasn't used. The point of the tithe was to take it not to God. The tithe wasn't taken to God, the tithe was shared. Right? It's the Thanksgiving sacrifice. So, number one, he put it in a silo and he didn't use it and didn't tithe it, didn't participate with God in the Thanksgiving sacrifice. So number one, that really makes sense, because at the end it says he had no riches before God. Get it? I mean, it's not like it's like an irony. It's like a perfect statement of end. The other thing was, if he didn't take the stuff from his silo, what did that also mean? Why do they keep stuff? They don't just store it in silos to store it in silos. Why do they store it in silos? You guys know, right?
For the winter.
Well, that's kind of the assumption we have, right? No, that's not why you store it. You put it in a silo so that the market, right? The market on wheat, you don't want to sell when everyone is selling their wheat. You want to sell when the market is highest. So therefore, what they do in the modern era is you sell what they call commodity trading, right? And that's what all the farmers, soybean guys, they keep their market in the silos and they make bets on commodity market to when they should sell their product. Well, if you're not selling your product, then
driving the price up for everybody else.
Yeah, you're affecting the price in a negative fashion. I mean, look, Jesus isn't dumb. This is what they did even in those days, but he expected everybody to be farmers, right? How many farmers in here? They're
Pass.
See? Well, you should know the answer to the question. That's what you always do, right? Commodity trader. I know a commodity trader here. So, commodity traders always, you sell your commodities.
That's what farmers in Kansas do it, but we
didn't even have computers back in the day.
Back in the day.
We didn't do it
Well,
that way.
and the government would force you to make your sales too, right? That's
If you
really
put something
great.
in a silo, you took it out to feed your cattle. That's how it's done in
We're
Wisconsin.
from Wisconsin, remember?
And in Kansas, they do it the way you say.
Yeah. Well, you want to make the most money, which is great. Making the most bang for your buck is an important thing, I think. But remember, Jesus said, right, that the parable of the talents. So he gave a guy 5 talents and expected to make more, right? So yeah, doing commodity trading with your silo is good, but holding it from the market, because you're trying to sell it at the most steepest price, and guess what? There's another parable about rotting. The other thing was, it says he stores up his goods. What does that mean? If you have so much junk that you have all this stuff and you put it in an extra room in your house, and so you have a room full of junk, right? I mean, I think that's the point is, right? So he's spending all of his money on stuff and then filling rooms in his house, which I thought the pastor was really good about talking about how much is spent on storage in America. I mean, that was kind of an irony in itself. So we have so much junk that we have to store it, right, in storage places. So I'm happy to say I don't have any storage places, and I'm going to be more cautious. Except the junk I have is mostly paper junk, which I should probably be in trouble for anyway.
Your office? Oh, my goodness.
No, yeah. That's man junk. Man junk doesn't count, you know? And it's not stacked on top of each other. Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
Careful.
Where's your minds? Okay. Anyway, we're cleaning up, we're finishing up here in Hebrews in the faith chapter. And we got to the last one. So I have the good, but you see, how can you use history, culture, and your understanding to interpret, not interpret's the wrong word, to understand what the history is behind some things that we've heard a million times, right? But you say, what does this mean? And then you can understand it better. Okay, so T-E-L-E-I-O-T-H-O-S-I-N, teleothosin. This is the declension of the verb, but teleo, we know that. That's what the word is, teleo. I want to give it to you again. Well, this is a little different form, but it's from telos, the primary of telo, is set out for a definite point or goal. The point aimed for, okay, very, very complex concept in Greek thought. The vanishing point on the horizon, basically, which intellectually means the logos to telos. Telos. The telos specifically is that vanishing point. In the Greek worldview, they're geometrically thinking, right? And I always like to remind you of this because this is a very complicated subject, complex subject, right? But yet, we blow over it, we just give it simplicity, but it isn't simple. It's literally, here's the logos, and the vanishing point on the horizon is the full the full concept of understanding what that logos intends. And remember, it's not stated. Do you notice that the vanishing point is an unstated point? Matter of fact, you don't even put it in a drawing. Of course, they weren't 3D drawers. You had to wait for Albert Dürer to get to 3D drawings, really, in the modern era. So, right, you know what I'm talking about. Anybody studied art? And what do you do when you do art, right? You draw perspective. That's what this is talking about. And the perspective is an unknown point. Can you imagine this? Here's a society, well, they did do a lot of sculpture, but they didn't have a lot of 3D art. There is some inklings of 3D art, right? In Greek and Roman friezes, right? You get shadowing and stuff like that, but it's just not common. Yet this word, and it specifically means, this teleo, means to complete. To complete. So really, this is more to complete. A teleo is unstated conclusion, and then to complete. P-E-R, and I don't know if the version I have, I took this, I always take it out of the version I have, which is based on the majority text. So this is supposed to be P-R-O, Kiminon. So peri is not that much different, but pro is for, like forefront, to the fore, F-O-R-E, to the front. And then kimei is to lie outstretched, basically to lay down. Lay down. So to lay, it means to stand forth, which is interesting. So to be in front of and lie outstretched. But it's translated to stand forth. To be present in mind. Translated into King James is to be first or set before. Close. I think a better understanding of this word might be like when you lay in front of a bulldozer, right? So you're trying to prevent something from happening, so you're, right? And maybe in a Greek construction, I mean, remember this is ancient world, so, but if let's say you lay down in front of a door, Ooh, where have we heard that before? Right? Why does a servant lay down in front of a door?
Protection.
Yeah, because what happens when you open the door? You smack the servant, right? And by the way, in Greek, okay, which way do our doors open in our society?
Oh,
Outward.
Our,
Well, it depends on what doors, like outside doors go out.
commercial out, residential in. There we go.
in history, our doors almost always open, especially the front doors to our residences. They always open in.
Yep.
And the reason they open inward is because the servant, well, there's a lot of reasons eventually we get to, barring the doors, etc. It's hard to bar a door when it opens to the outside, right? I mean, it's possible, but it's difficult. But the main reason is because in front of the door, the servant lies down, and that way, if intruder or someone comes into the house, before they had locks or bars or anything like that, you had to push against them. In the Orient, the doors open to the outside. They open to the outside. And the reason for that is because their entryways, they always take their shoes off, and the entryways have a shoe off place. So if the door opened into it, it would strike the shoes, it would strike it would occlude the entryway. So their doors always open to the outside, unless you have a Western
Or
building.
slide this way.
Well, the exterior doors in Japan, the interior doors slide, right? The exterior doors open. And there's a reason for that too, because why is it hard to make sliding doors on the exterior of a building? Now, farmers know this. How do they make their sliding doors? What do they do for a sliding?
Slide.
Huh?
Their barn doors slide.
Yeah, how they do it though?
Well, they
Yeah.
outside with rails.
They put the rails on the top, right?
Yeah.
Where are Japanese rails? Where are Oriental rails? And I'm talking about, like China and Japan and Korea and all those places. Where are the rails? They're on the bottom. So what happens? Well, not just trip. The rails, if let's say I put on an exterior door, what's going to happen? Debris, dirt, mud, water. You get, and plus everything's made of wood there, right? So, and they didn't invent what we invented, which is the rail type doors. Plus, those doors do not seal very well, if you haven't noticed, right? Barn doors. But in America, the sliding barn doors, the rail's on the top and they roll,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But in Japan, the interior doors have a sliders. And the other thing is, in Japan, in the old days, they never stepped on the rail. You know why, right? They're made of wood. You can break them. But also, if you get debris, like if you have debris on your feet, or dust or anything, you'll slide it into the rails, and that will prevent the doors from opening. So, in classic Japanese thought or Chinese thought, you ever remember you've probably seen this, right? In the old movies or whatever, the woman in the gate, the woman in the kimono kneels, opens the door, stands, steps in, kneels, closes the door. So it's all part of their culture. But all cultures are like that. So, and can you imagine? Okay, in the ancient world, everybody knows how the doors work, right? Just like you know how your doors work in your house. Especially if you had a servant that was laying in front of the door, you would really know what it meant, right? Because every time if somebody tried to open the door, it's like, get out of the way, right? But I'm just saying that it's really interesting how the cultural knowledge, right? Little bits and pieces. And we usually don't deconstruct them. That is to understand them fully. Anyway, let's look at, we were at the end of 40. I'm going to, I'll just go back to, let's see. Where's my marker? I'm going to go back just for a second to 39 and remind you. 39 in the NIV says, we're 11. This is 11. These are all commended for their faith. At the end of the faith chapter, who was the first faith? I was going to look it up. Who was the first person? Was it Abel or? Abel?
Abel offered
Yeah, by faith in God.
Abel?
Yeah.
And then the last one is Rahab. I can't spell it. Rahab, something like that. Rahab. Male? Female? He's dead. Poor guy. You got croaked, right? Abel was killed for his, if you like, for his persuasion. Right? We'd say for his faith, but killed for his persuasion, pistis. Rahab lived. Female lived, right? I think it's really interesting, all the ones in between. And then we had I thought it was very interesting because then we have the abbreviated section, right? That mentions all these groups and peoples and things. And then we get to 39. This is the NIV. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. And then 39, this is a translation. And these, everyone, were a witness through persuasion, not to provide for the message of the gods, not to provide for the gospels. And I told you, this is what really irritated me about the translation we have. Because I gave it to you, if you remember, the translation of 2, of the second verse. Assigning a reason, in this the members of the Israelite Sanhedrin became a witness. So in 2, here's our group, and then I guess the miscellaneous, right? The miscellaneous group. But we started with the 70. We started with the Sanhedrin, right? The Sanhedrin were a witness. Well, we all knew who else were witnesses to this other than the Sanhedrin.
Disciples, other people.
Well, let me put it in perspective, okay? So here's Jerusalem, and here's the Galil, and here's Babylon. These are the 4 schools, and here's the Alexandrian school. So the presumption, I think this is the correct presumption. I tried to prove it to you before. The presumption is this is written after 70 A.D. 70 A.D., the reason 70 A.D. is a seminal mark in history is because of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Romans. And most specific, well, by this time Nero was dead, but Nero was the guy who started this, and it was concluded by his successor. So the Romans and Nero destroyed Jerusalem. I've told you before, I don't think many of them went to Babylon. The Galil is way too close. Some of them probably went to their family, others in the diaspora. But the place to go would be Alexandria, because there is a temple. The destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, but there is a non-destroyed temple in Alexandria. There's also another temple, but it was destroyed too. You know what it was?
The Essene Temple?
Yeah. The Essenes. Well, we don't know. Although that's a great, I wonder about this. This is something that in Israel, you know what they're looking for, right? They're looking for the Essene Temple. They've been looking for the Essene Temple for a long time. How long have they been looking for the Essene Temple? Do you know? When did the Essene Temple get to be the Essene Temple? Okay, I'll try to remember exact dates, but it was around 270 BC, I think. 270 BC, something like that. The Maccabean period. Maybe it's 230. Anyway, when was the temple redone? I think it was 270 BC. Anyway, in the Maccabean period, just before the Maccabean period, what happened? You remember the historical basis? So
Alexander the Great, then his empire got split up.
And they invited the Romans to come in and help them.
And the leaders were not so good to the Judeans.
according to the Maccabees, Jonathan, the priest, began bringing in Jewish or Greek practice and telling the priests to begin Jewish practice. That is what caused the Maccabean revolt. The main precursor to the Maccabean revolt was not, the Greeks were not good at building aqueducts, and they weren't good at building roads. But the Greeks had brought in, the Greek Hellenization was was reforming the Levant and reforming this point. But the thing they really didn't like, the thing that really caused the Maccabean revolt, and remember the Maccabees was supposed to be a Levite. He never claimed to be an Aaronite, but he was a Levite, supposedly. The Maccabees were irritated because Jonathan the priest began encouraging the priest to go to the baths, to go to the hippodrome, to go to the gymnasiums, to begin learning Greek, and was basically Hellenizing the Jewish faith in lots of ways. By the way, going to the baths and the hippodrome and the gymnasium meant that priests would have to
Yeah,
disrobe, and many of the priests had stopped circumcising their children, and there was actually, they were doing surgeries to undo their circumcision. That's in the Maccabees too. So historically we know the thing that really caused that. Now what happened was the Maccabees came in, and the Maccabees started their stuff. The Maccabees, the father, and I can't remember his name, but his first son was named high priest and king. What's the problem with that?
That's the Messiah's title, right? Well, and you can't be both because you
Can't be both.
yeah.
And he was a Levite and not an Aaronite. So his son was not in Aaron. So what happened was the last Aaronite priest, who by the way had connections to this Jonathan, but because they were related, but also he was kind of in disfavor, right? Do you see how this works, right? The Aaronite priesthood, Jonathan eventually got croaked by the Greeks and also by the Maccabees. Maccabees weren't happy with me. He was banished and eventually croaked. But his relation became the next Aaronite priest. And he said, I'm not going to accept this. So he took the Sadducees and those who would go with him and went out into the desert and created what are called the Essenes. So the first Essene was probably, and we believe historically, was the Aaronite. That's where the Aaronite priesthood went. They got a problem though. What's the problem?
The only legitimate place to worship is the temple in Jerusalem.
Bingo.
Or sacrifice, at least.
So the whole of the Essene literature is about how you sacrifice outside the temple. There's a huge body of Essene literature, and we're still looking for the pieces parts. That is the Mishnah type. Now, remember, the Sadducees didn't believe in the Mishnah. The Essenes produced a huge body of literature about how is it supposed to work. There was another group creating a whole new body of literature. Who were those guys? Do you remember? The Pharisees. What's the problem? What's the problem with the Maccabees in Jerusalem at the temple?
Well, they're not the right descendants.
Yeah, the high priest is not an Aaronite, right? As a matter of fact, can a Levite be a priest? The only way you can be a priest is you have to be a descendant of Aaron, right? But now you have non-descendants of Aaron who are Levites who are sacrificing in the temple. So what do the Pharisees have to do?
Try to legitimize it.
Yeah, they did. They actually did. They had to. As a matter of fact, they already had a body of this literature. How did they have a body of literature that was legitimizing not sacrificing and not having a temple?
Well, Babylon, I suppose.
Yeah, remember? They're the ones who got taken to the Babylonian Empire, and guess what? Remember, I keep telling you, the people that were left with this were the Samaritans, and the Samaritans are more Jewish than the Babylonian Jews, right? The Samaritans, now, the intellectuals, all the nobility and intellectuals, the nobility were castrated, but, and who knows, but the intellectuals, the servants they brought with them to Babylon, right, became the next generation of Jewish people. Because they castrated all the priests and the royalty, right?
Somehow, not everybody that must have been, because Jesus' lineage goes through the line of kings. So somehow it had to be continued.
It's through the mother. So who knows who the father was? Remember, this is a problem for Jewish culture. There's a reason why the lineage, whenever you see a culture or society where the lineage goes through the mother, there is always a problem with that culture. Why?
You don't know for sure who the father is.
Yeah. Do you wonder why they had problems? Look at old David, right? I'm just saying, there are issues culturally. When you see these cultural issues, you just don't go, well, that's normal, right? You go, well, what's wrong with the culture? There are different cultures, and that's the diversity thing, right? They keep teaching us, but
So
they don't really teach
Where do they think the
us.
esteemed temple is?
Huh?
Where do they think the esteemed temple is?
Well, Masada has always been considered one of the main possible sites, but we don't really know. And they may have done it like, okay, if you're not happy with what you're doing, and you're not happy with the lineage or ideas, what would you do?
Make it up.
Well, yeah, or make it in secret, right? Right. It's that's what happened, right? The Mysterions were all about secrets. Now, the Christianity looked like a Mysterion, but it was not about secrets. But all the Mysterions were about secrets. Well, where do you think? Okay, remember our train of thought: animism, pantheonic paganism, Mysterion, Gnosticism. Where do you think the Essenes are going to go if they're disconnected from their normal religious kind of view?
Mysterious.
Yeah, they're moving toward Mysterion. As a matter of fact, that's what all the writing is. And what did they do with it? Remember? They took the writing, they put it into a pot, and that's how we got the Dead Sea Scrolls. What were they treating their documents like? Secrets. Yeah. It's really interesting. We don't find Gnostic writings with the Dead Sea Scrolls, but yet the Gnostics were doing Mysterion stuff. They had their mystery documents, right? The Gospel of Thomas is considered a Gnostic, document. There's all kinds of stuff. There's just all this stuff is happening, right? The problem is trying to peg it historically, because we know bits and pieces, but we got to put the bits and pieces together. So the point is that we start with 70, but who were the witnesses? All those people that came from Jerusalem, right? And I'll even point out again, who was Luke written to? Theophilus, which means lover of God, right? Which we think there was a Theophilus who was a high priest in Jerusalem in this period. So we know the Sadducees. Remember in Acts it says many priests came to know Christ or were persuaded of Christ. And so where did those guys go? Right here. This is where their families, this is where the other temple is. This is where the center of Judaism is in Alexandria. So we have the 70, and you notice we go through all these witnesses to Rahab, who is a woman, who is an independent woman with no man, that's controlling her, the head of her household. And then we have the miscellaneous. Well, who are the miscellaneous? That's these guys. That's our Hebrews. Which Hebrews, I tell you, the Hebrews aren't just the Hebrews, the Romans, the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Hebrews, and probably some other miscellaneous, whatever, right? It's being written to all these groups, and we see this indication in the Greek. So this miscellaneous, the beginning is this, and the end it says, and these, every one, were a witness through persuasion, not to provide for the message of the gods. As a matter of fact, you can apply that back to our Sanhedrin. Because the Sanhedrin were witnesses, but what happened? Did they accept it? Were they persuaded?
Not all of them, anyway.
Not all of them.
Yeah. Some, and I would agree, some were, right? As a matter of fact, if we take Paul's, we know 1/3 were persuaded, 1/3 said, let me hear some more, and 1/3 said,
Yeah.
I'll see you later, right? So, a third of these guys, right? And there was still another third seeking. So anyway, so with that, 40. God had, this is the NIV, God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. This, by the way, is the last verse in this Logos to Telos part. This isn't really the end of this Logos to Telos, but look what it says. God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. The very first, Hebrews 11, we translated, but persuasion stands under an expectation of proof of deeds not seen. That's the whole logical premise, the logical beginning, the logical definition, assumption, starting that beginning. And then the very last one says, and this is the NIV, God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. Now, let's parse it. Let's see what it actually says in the Greek. God, theos, having provided, it's problepo, to look out beforehand. That's kind of different than having provided. To look out beforehand. Some, tis some, better thing, treeton, stronger, for peri, all through, all over. It's not really for, it's peri through. Us, Haman, of us, that is us, no kidding us. That, hina me, that not. They is added, but it's implied because of the verb. Without, choris, add a space, that's choris, that's that word, chasm, choris, add a space. Us, Haman for us, should is added, not hinami, be made perfect. Teleeu, to complete. To complete. Not made perfect, but to complete. So here's a literal translation. God to look out beforehand, some stronger through all over of us, in order that not at a space of us to complete. Okay, let's see if we can put this into more, understandable form. God looked out beforehand at some stronger of us, in order that through all over we could complete, not at a space. God looked out beforehand. In other words, God was planning this all beforehand, right? Planning all this beforehand, looked out beforehand at some stronger of us. Who's the stronger of us?
Jesus.
Well, the stronger of us is those who are persuaded, right? All those who were persuaded were the stronger of us. This is when I get to, okay, remember what I said? Why did God pick one and not the other? Because the other wouldn't do it, right? It wasn't that God said, miraculously, okay, you're fated.
Right.
You're fated to do this.
Chose the one he knew would do it.
Yeah, and they did it, even though they did it imperfectly. This is important. They did it imperfectly. Look at David. Look at, David's not in our list. Right? These are imperfect people, right, that were persuaded. They were the stronger because they did it. They were persuaded. The stronger of us, in order that through all, if there was a breakdown, now, like I said before, it's not fated. If it were fated and there was a breakdown, right? But God goes, okay, Jokaham over here didn't do his work. He was not persuaded. Sorry, dude. But, hey, Elijah, Will you do it? Right? And Elijah goes, well, not at first, right?
Ran away then, yeah.
And then Elijah had to smack him a couple. Didn't Elijah smack him a couple of times? I think, or his servant did. Anyway, yeah. You see how this works, right? But eventually he was persuaded, and you say, well, maybe he was stronger or weaker. Remember when the guy asked Jesus, he said, come follow me. That's a great offering from Jesus, right? And the guy said, well, let me go back and bury my parents first. Remember? And Jesus pounded him. Well, if he'd been speaking to Elijah, maybe he wouldn't get another chance. I think it's really interesting, right? Elijah may not have been there if he wasn't given another chance. Harmatia. We've been talking about harmatia, right? Miss the mark. There is sin in the Jewish sense, and then we mistranslate, I think, this harmatia thing. Because the harmatia thing isn't about sinning. It's about hitting the mark. So, you may be persuaded, but you may be persuaded, but be like that rich guy, right? In his storeroom and keeping his storeroom up. So guess what? Nothing gets done. I'm persuaded, but nothing's getting done, right? That's the whole point of this Hebrews. That you're persuaded and therefore you go do something with it, right? That's the point. Okay, that's historical theology, but I mean, that's the point, right? So, God looked out beforehand at some stronger of us in order that through all we could complete, not at a space. We could complete not at a space. The not at a space place might not be as critical to us. Why would there be a space? Why would there be a distance? You want to complete, right? But you want to complete all together. The reason there's a space, you got two spaces. Well, you got multiple spaces. Number one, there's a space right now between Jerusalem and Alexandria, or wherever you want, okay? Wherever you think they went. There's a space between here and there and here and there and here in the diaspora. In other words, is there a temple that you can legally sacrifice in? No. That's a space. That's a physical space. There's also a mental space. The mental space is, these guys were all sacrificing, right? The Thanksgiving sacrifice. Guess what they can't do anymore? Can't do the Thanksgiving sacrifice. I know Rick was looking up John Chrysostom. He is the guy. John Chrysostom solved the problem for Christianity. Because can you imagine? Do you know what Christianity was at a space, or Teen Hodos was at a space for about 200 years. After the destruction of Jerusalem, they had a problem. How do we do the Thanksgiving sacrifice? Now, look, is the Thanksgiving sacrifice necessary? That's an interesting question. If you didn't do communion, could you be saved?
The thief on the cross was.
Well, so was all. What did Paul say? Believe, actually said, pistis, be convinced of the Lord Jesus Christ and be baptized, right? And even in one case he said, be convinced of the Lord Jesus Christ. He didn't put in the baptized part, right? A couple of times. But the minimals for salvation is, the minimal for salvation is to be convinced.
I'd say if you're convinced and you have time, like you're not going to die like the thief on the cross that day, and you don't do the sacrament, say like the Salvation Army, I'd say you're in really dangerous waters there because you're disobeying the Lord and not believing what He said. So your actions are not matching what you said you believed.
That is precisely correct, right? Because if, like the guy on the cross, right? Now the guy on the cross, maybe he was sitting there screaming with his loudest voice, I believe, I trust, in Jesus, right? But he didn't have the opportunity to be baptized, to confess his faith, to live in Christ, to repent,
To have communion.
Right? So we have 200 years. Now what were they doing in those 200 years? How did they do the Thanksgiving sacrifice? Well, you had some that were doing the Thanksgiving sacrifice in the temple. To a Christian, that should make, to Teen Hodos, it should make a big difference, right? Because what did Paul say?
We're the temple of the Holy Spirit. It's no longer associated with that one place.
And is it okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols?
As long as you're not participating in it, but if you buy it at the market, then yes.
Yeah, I
And
think.
you don't offend your brother.
Yeah, right.
Well, I think that's don't offend your brother is the basis, right? That's what Paul wrote. What did the apostolic fathers tell us? What did the Jerusalem council tell you?
Avoid meat sacrificed to
No,
idols.
don't eat sacrificed meat. It didn't say avoid. It said don't eat meat sacrificed to idols, which meant you're in bad shape. The other option you had was, remember, kosher butchers. There are kosher butchers. Guess where they are? They're in Galilee, Jerusalem, not so much, Babylon, and Alexandria, and in some of the parts of the diaspora, we know they're kosher butchers. So therefore, you could go and you couldn't get a sacrifice, but you could eat meat that was legitimate meat, right? And what do we know that Paul and okay, I hate to say it, but there wasn't a split. It's not a split. There was a divergence in view. Paul said it's okay. The Apostolic Council said it's not to eat meat sacrificed to idols. What is the big deal for Teen Hodos?
Peter, he had the whole, vision, right, that came down that basically said that it's okay, you can eat these things.
Yeah, he did.
They weren't sacrifices, they were just unclean animals.
But it
Well,
wasn't what was going into this little.
And it was a metaphor for go to the Gentiles.
Yes.
but you're right. Yeah, you're right. Well, we see also in the evidence of Christ where it says he declared everything that, clean, right? Because what does clean mean? You guys remember? Why is it clean and unclean? What is clean? What is it about that's clean?
Does it matter how it's killed?
Oh yeah,
Yes. So there's both. It's the animal itself. So there were some animals that no matter how you killed them were unclean.
Yes.
But then there were clean animals, but if you botched that up, they were still unclean.
Yes, perfect. And also, you could be unclean.
Yeah, from lots of different stuff.
The whole point of cleanliness, there's only one point of cleanliness. The point of cleanliness was to eat teruma. The teruma was the Thanksgiving sacrifice. It's the sacrifices. So to eat the sacrifices, you had to be clean and the animal had to be clean. All right. We have Jesus saying you don't have to be clean, the animals don't have to be clean, which subsumes that you don't have to be clean, right? And we have Paul saying it's okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols. We have the Apostolic Council saying, no, you don't. What is the Thanksgiving sacrifice of Christianity that was given to us by Jesus? The communion, but what was it originally?
The Passover.
Passover, yeah, Passover Seder.
The Seder. Okay, in the Seder, what did you have?
Lamb,
Lamb is the sacrifice, right? That's the main thing.
unleavened bread,
Unleavened bread. They had some other stuff. They had the
bitter
wine.
herbs,
Wine,
and
bitter
fruit,
herbs, the cherub sets,
sweet apples or whatever.
yeah, the cherub set.
And
Yeah.
wine.
Well, a lot of these were the main ones they would have that we know from the Last Supper, right? From the Eucharistic meal, from the Passover. The Seder is the lamb, the unleavened bread, and the wine. So there's the other stuff, right, that are classically, what do you call it? They're not required by the Torah, but they're, what would you call them?
Tradition.
Tradition.
Yeah.
Tradition, right? They're the traditions, right? And they're great. We do those kind of traditions, right? Our church does a Seder. We do a Seder at home during the Passover, during the Easter time. So the point is that if you were going to do it, now could you get unleavened bread? Could you get wine?
Yeah.
Okay, the thing you couldn't get was, and actually you could, because remember what does the Torah say you're supposed to do?
The bone of the lamb.
Well, the Torah says that each family is to take a lamb, an unblemished lamb, and they are supposed to kill it themselves.
Right.
You don't sacrifice, right? So there were options. So what we had was now, but the problem is, can you just kill lambs in the ancient world? Can you just take a lamb and kill it? No, you had to do what? You had to take it. Okay, got to put the Greek blinders on, right? You're Greek in Roman lands. You're a Greek person. You're a Hebrew in Greek lands. It doesn't matter where you are. If you have a Jewish temple, you could take your lamb to a Jewish temple to have it sacrificed, but you have to go through the ascension, the sin and guilt sacrifice, the priest sacrifice, and then you finally get to the Thanksgiving sacrifice. But you can do it at one of those. You can take it to a kosher butcher. The kosher butcher, if there's one around. However, if you just want to kill something, can you take it in your backyard and slaughter it? No, because the Greeks, the next thing you know, the Greeks are going to be on your head, and the Romans too, and they're going to split your throat. And they're going to say, you sacrificed an animal, and it wasn't legitimately accomplished. So the only way you can legitimately sacrifice an animal is you have to take it to, you have your choices. One of the Greek temples, Roman temples, to the Jewish temple, or to a Jewish kosher butcher.
Why do the Greeks and Romans care?
Because remember, it's about the city-state. The city-state is about, in the world, okay, if you're in Athens, who did you worship? Athena, period, dot. If you walk around in there and you say something negative about Athena, what's going to happen to you?
Nothing good.
As a matter of fact, they did have a place where you could talk about the gods. Where was that? Mars Hill was one. Now, if you said something negative about the gods, you probably still would be croaked. They had the Shola, the Lyceum, the gymnasiums. They had places you could go to discuss philosophy. But, as Socrates showed us, if you said something that was negative, what would happen to you? The same thing's true because religion is the basis. Now, we know that the Athenians had a market, a Jewish market, that was not allowed in the Agora. Okay? Eventually, the Romans, the Greeks, they allowed them because the Jewish people were doing transport trade. But what was the first people to get persecuted if something happened in the city?
Jews.
Right? Or any group. Remember, the Pythagoreans were murdered. I can't remember what city, maybe it was Thebes, but the Pythagoreans had set up mysterions all around Greece. And the Pythagoreans were viewed as a very negative group for some reason to the Greeks. And the first thing that happened, the minute I think it was an earthquake or a famine, something happened, guess what they did to the Pythagoreans? They killed them. They killed them, banished them, killed them. Remember Soitinus. Okay, you guys remember Soitinus? He's that guy, Soitinus. Soitinus was the Roman, and what did Nero do? Soitinus says that Nero cast all the mysterions, including the mysterion of Christus, out of Rome. We think that there was, Nero was used to using political things to advantage, but we think something happened, an earthquake, a famine, people got sick, I don't know. And so Nero cast out all the mysterions, including the mysterion of Christus, from Rome. The reason is because the coherence of a city-state is not based on politics, it's based on culture. Culture in those days had only one thing. There was no secular cultures in the ancient world. None at all. No one had an idea what secular could ever be. There had to be gods and spirits doing stuff, right? So the big deal is that if you were sacrificing outside the temple, outside a temple, or any of the legitimate things, that was an abomination. Remember what happened when the Greeks, well, yeah, it was the Greeks at first. The Greeks came in, took over the temple, and they built they destroyed the Mesoplane, right? And they put the altar, they made sure the altar was outside of the temple, right? And they sacrificed what on it? Pigs to Zeus. Okay? To the Hebrews, an abomination. To the Greeks,
That's the whole thing they could do.
yeah. And they said, it's an abomination for you to have a temple enclosed. They said, you are primitive barbarian people because you have an enclosed temple and you have an altar inside the enclosure of your temple. So to them, the Hebrews were bad, right? So by purifying the temple, by sacrificing to Zeus with a pig on the temple, on the altar, they were purifying Jerusalem. They wiped out Jerusalem and the temple. Why? What did they replace it with? Jewish temple, or Roman temple, Greek temples, Roman temples, right? Because the gods were the power of the city-states. And if you affronted the gods, you affronted the whole city-state. So that's why you just couldn't go and do what you wanted to do. So you couldn't take your lamb in your backyard, sacrifice it, or kill it, slaughter it, and then eat it. Because your neighbors would rat on you. And you're in bad trouble, right? This is why I said, remember the Essenes? Why the Essenes may have not had a temple with a normal altar. Their altar was probably secret and hidden. See? Because that way you could get away with it, right? As long as someone didn't catch it. Well, they did catch him. Masada, they wiped him out, but that was a whole other problem. So, when we see this, what is amazing, the space was, they're talking about all kinds of space, right? The space of the distance between the temple, the space of the distance between what they wanted to do and thought they could do. The space of the distance, because Teen Hodos is not transforming into something new, but it's a sect of Judaism that is suddenly cut off from Judaism. As a matter of fact, the Sadducees were suddenly, they're cut off from Judaism. Can you have Judaism without the temple? No. Can you have Judaism without the sacrifice? Guess what?
They're trying to, but
Huh?
They're trying to today, but
They're trying to. And they did it in the other diasporas. But we have the 5 sects of Judaism. Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots, and Teen Hodos. Which one is still sacrificing?
we are, because we do the Thanksgiving sacrifice.
Bingo. Okay. The others do not sacrifice at all because the temple's been destroyed. Yes, sir.
So is the answer to the question you proposed about what's going on in the first couple hundred years until our buddy John clarifies things, is it just kind of a mishmash depending on where you are in Asia Minor or in Egypt or wherever?
Yes.
All these different groups are trying to figure their way.
There are 2 things going on. Number 1, the importance of the communion was probably not what it is to us today. The communion to us, you notice what do we say? We say that we do it, first of all, in remembrance.
which is what Jesus said.
Precisely. The point is that once you get past the first generation of witnesses, you suddenly need a remembrance. Right? That's a critical thing that was not as critical in the first generation of Christians, of Teen Hodos. They needed a remembrance. Guess what? These guys kind of didn't-ish. They're not following their religion. They're not following the Judaistic, Mosaic covenant at all. Yeah.
I'm going back here in like the Torah and looking about the Passover again, because I never really considered that. The Passover was like they didn't have to do it at the temple. I mean, he was saying everybody kill your own lamb and do these different things. So why didn't the Jews then, or even now, still do that? Since they don't need the temple for it.
I agree. And if we look back, we would say, okay, number one, we are in the Gnostic era. So we have science and reason behind us, right? Literacy, philosophy, science. So we have the ability to think reasonably and think with archetypes and concepts, because that we have literacy, right? And we have philosophy. So we can draw that conclusion. The problem is that before you had that ability, people could not draw that conclusion. The world is based on what you see and what you think you know, right? Spirits, gods, whatever, are moving the world. Even in the Mysterion era. They're predictable, but they're still spirits and stuff moving the world. So, when you say, number one, the power of tradition, right? Remember, I told you, why did they bring the Passover lambs to the temple? Did they have to? Not by the Torah, but they did it because there's a couple of reasons. Number one, they said all sacrifices must be made to the God in the temple, right? And so that became an immutable tradition and law in the culture. The other thing is, that's the way you always did it. Why would you do any differently? Number three, who benefited by that?
The priests, Levites.
Yeah, priests, Levites, Pharisees to a degree, because Pharisees ran the sacrificial markets, right? Essenes, not so much. Zealots, who cares? But the big deal is the power of tradition, the power of powerful things. And you put on top of that this cultural thing that is absolutely, you can't ever forget this. You can't just kill things in the ancient world. You just can't do it. When the children of Israel sacrificed the Passover lambs in Egypt, how do you think they got away with that? If you had a whole people that are your slaves and they're sacrificing animals to their God, what do you think that does to the Pharaoh, to the priests, to the whole, Theban Egyptian culture?
It's kind of a revoltish kind of.
It is a total revolt. It is not just a revolt, it is a revolt. It is like you are saying all your gods are nothing.
But
right?
of course, immediately after that, all their firstborns got killed, so they were a little distracted by that.
They were distracted. It also meant that in the household, did it say the father sacrificed it or the mother? And yes, end of time. Just think about this thought. At the very end, who sacrificed the lamb? It does say. Everyone together sacrificed the lamb. Everyone became a priest. Yes. Everyone from the smallest child to the oldest adult was a priest. Women, children, slaves. Everyone in the household sacrificed the lamb.
The original one in Egypt says every man shall take a lamb according to their father's houses.
Every man shall take a lamb according to their houses. But if you look, it says they'll raise the lamb together, and then the presumption is that they all, of course.
You're right. Okay. And then
right?
you shall keep it to the 14th day of this month, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight. So it doesn't specify there.
Bingo! Bingo! This is really important idea. Anyway, thank you, Father, for your word. We pray you look at us this week. In your name we pray, amen.